Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, preparing to check in on those two systems that you see right there dead ahead, top left of the shelf. Those are my two oldest systems. It's been 10 days now since we last checked in on these bins, and I've got a little bit of information about them here. It was 10 days ago that we came in here to give them their fourth feeding. It was not just an everyday feeding, it was a horizontal migration feeding, which really just means that the edge of the bin was fed rather than any other part of the bin. That edge is where I'm trying to lure the worms over to so I can collect them up and haul them out. And that was actually 41 days after that migration had initially started. So over those 41 days, 4 separate feedings to just reinforce the feeding area, add a little bit of bedding, perhaps even stir up the old castings material that the worms occupy to help dry it, make it less appealing for the worms to remain in, hopefully prompting their exit of the material. And today, I believe we're at the point where we're ready to start hauling worms out. So yeah, those 10 days ago when we last checked in, it was, yeah, you're doing the math right, it was exactly 1 year old that those systems had been put into service. I've got some information here showing the estimated population of those bins when they were put in service over a year ago. But over that much time, things definitely change. So whether there's that many worms living in these systems or more at this point, it's hard to say. So after 334 days of composting and now 41 days of migrating, 375 days in total, I'm looking to haul these worms out of their old home, move them into some new homes. So I'm going to slip on a glove and we're going to get to work. So let's get started. We're starting in bin number 1, and I've only got one container, I believe, that's large enough to hold what I'm expecting to pull out of here, because I did build these feeding zones a little bit bigger than usual. I mean, I started out building them kind of the same general size as I usually do, but I've attempted to increase the size of the feeding zone each time we came in here, continuing to nudge over the old stuff and gradually trying to make the new side, or at least not so much new side, but the side that I'm trying to lure the worms into, a little bit bigger so that it's big enough to big enough to handle the occupants, assuming that we're going to have a pretty good sized turnout, hopefully. So I guess the one trick to having bubble wrap as your plastic covering is that in between the bubbles is where the worms usually end up. And it's kind of easy to miss one. So I'm just attempting to make sure we've not left any unfortunate little wormies behind on the bubble wrap. So I don't want to just assume that I've succeeded in finding them all. I'll usually fold the plastic over so it doesn't dry out abruptly and leave the worms stranded in an uncomfortable place. I will come back and more thoroughly examine that material just to make sure there's no other worms left behind. But let's get to the work at hand here. The main task is going to be just the extraction of the material that's in here, and I hope that this is big enough. I mean, it almost seems like it's twice what this container can hold, but the depth is what I'm hoping saves us here. I do have a feeling this is going to be mounded up quite full. So I'm thinking maybe we can see about creating a delineation between the finished castings and the migration area. Now, I do anticipate the need to continue with this migration, although I do assume at this point that we're going to have the lion's share of the worms out of the material. I'm fairly certain we're not going to have all of them out. So I will be coming back here later with some fresh bedding, perhaps a replacement partition, and I'll be attempting to reset this migration so that the process can continue and we can attempt to get the last of the worms out of this material before we consider it as a harvested batch of castings. So I'm not so worried about being 100% thorough over here. I'm also, I guess, not going to include that on the video because coming in here with some bedding and some food and rebuilding this edge of the bin to be a sort of a restarted or continued migration feeding zone is not that exciting. This video is really going to be focused more on the extraction of the worms from their old home and the launch of the new bin. Now, something I have kind of made into a tradition here in my wormery is the inclusion of the input of the viewers to try to establish an estimate for how many worms are being used to launch off a new bin. So when these little guys get plopped into their new home, we'll get another chance to check them out and see how many we've got. But it's during this time too, during the extraction of the migration feeding zone, that I also like to try to give the viewers a opportunity to see what we're talking about here in terms of the number of worms that got hauled out and relocated. And it's a little bit difficult sometimes to see because there's all kinds of material in here, like these shredded pieces of paper and cardboard that, you know, definitely resemble worms. So you gotta look with a keen eye to try to distinguish the worms themselves from the material that they're occupying here. And then I'll usually ask the viewers at the end of the video to provide me with a comment to tell me what they think in terms of how many worms did we manage to haul out and launch the new system with. And you know, I really do get that feeling like I might need a secondary container to hold the remainder of the worms in this migration feeding zone, because I feel like I'm out of space here and I really don't want to have, you know, the material mounding up over the top edge of the container. You might be able to tell from right here by my thumb too how the plastic is flexing under the weight of the container too. So you know what, I'm going to reach behind me. So we've got a little bit more to go here. I do have a couple other containers we could use here. I'm assuming that the larger is the better one to go with here. So this is a little bit more than we normally go with. And I did sort of question how I'm going to pull this off. Sometimes I am able to unload 2 bins at once by putting some of them into that container that we were just working with, as well as some into this one here, and then have all the worms unloaded from 2 systems in 2 separate containers. But it does seem like on this go around we are going to need 2 containers to unload today's batch of worms from their horizontal migration feeding zone, primarily because of the fact that I did continue to increase the size of the horizontal migration feeding zone each time I came in here to feed. And hopefully by doing so we've provided the worms with a nice spacious environment into which they can migrate, a space that's nice and damp and stocked with food, and you know, starkly different from the material that I'm trying to get them to leave. Material that was left uncovered, unfed, and hopefully left to dry enough to the point where it became a little bit uncomfortable for the worms, prompting their exit out of the material. So I really didn't think I was going to need a second container, but I'm already at the point where I'm almost out of room in the second container. And these are 2 pretty good sized containers, I must say. Wow. And I guess by making the horizontal migration feeding zones fairly spacious, we didn't really end up seeing any one particular spot in either of these, or anywhere in this horizontal migration feeding zone, that was like so densely packed with worms. They were given plenty of space to spread out and be comfortable. So maybe it wasn't so much of a spectacle here to just be able to reach into here and grab a handful of stuff that's just all tons and tons of worms. But when it's all said and done and you think about all the material here, this stuff as well as this stuff, and how much of it there is, there's a good number of worms in here. So I'm going to set this aside briefly, and then we'll get the new bin out here into which all this is going to get dropped. And I'm glad I left room in that in that other container, because we're going to need that room for all that stuff. I really didn't anticipate having so much stuff. So this stuff here, right here, this old partition, I'll be able to reuse that stuff right there. Oops, we had an extra worm here. stuck to that cardboard. There might be a couple others, but whatever. That cardboard is going to probably get reused when I rebuild this feeding zone here. And the fact that there's a few worms still stuck to the container here, that don't matter. We'll end up rounding them up on the second go around of trying to haul more worms out of this material. But I'm still curious as far as how this material is doing in general in terms of being depopulated. So at this point I'll usually try to assess how much we've still got to go. Oh my goodness, we've got quite a ways to go. I almost wonder if the worms might have actually made their way over into the horizontal migration feeding zone, helped nibble away some of the yummy foods that had been placed in there for them to lure them out of their castings, and then simply returned back into their castings. Sometimes I do wonder, because I have actually created time-lapse videos attempting to depict what happens in one of these migrations in a see-through container over the course of weeks of time passing. And you can certainly see that the worms don't all just go move in one direction towards the feeding zone away from their finished castings. They sort of come and go. And until their finished castings become perhaps a little bit dry and a little bit uncomfortable, they're perfectly content to just go hang out in that stuff. And it does seem to me like perhaps the most ideal way to get one of these migrations to be highly successful is to really let the material become such that it's no longer really very comfortable for the worms to remain in. By that I mean dry, not dry to the point where it's dangerous for the worms, but drier than I don't know, I'm not even sure how to express that, just drying to the point where the worms are definitely looking for something a little bit better. You can see over on this far edge, furthest away from where the feeding zone was, a good amount of material that's fairly free of worm traffic, meaning that perhaps that stuff had actually dried to the point where the worms were not too thrilled about being in it anymore. And perhaps the stuff that was closest to the migration zone, close to the section of the bin that was still covered with plastic, perhaps that stuff on the edge was still nice and cozy. But the stuff all the way out here furthest away from the feeding zone certainly seems like it was dry enough to the point where the worms were not interested in being in that stuff anymore. And that might be the level of dryness we want to attain, so that we've got a box full of highly motivated worms that are very interested in finding themselves something a little bit more comfortable. Like I said, not leaving them in material that's going to make them be at risk, just material that's getting to the point where it could be possible that they're interested in finding something a little bit more comfortable to hang out in. So like I said, this migration will continue, that's for sure. Look at all the worms remaining in this stuff. A lot of worms. And it does seem like by spreading the material out like so, it's going to be able to dry a little bit. But then again, I'm going to be nudging it all back over and stacking it up so I can re-establish the horizontal migration feeding zone with some fresh materials and some fresh food. But I'm going to be doing that off camera. That's not all that interesting. I think we got to get their new home out here, the worms that we did succeed in hauling out, and release batch 1. And we've still got a second bin to do the same treatment on. So let's get that going. Alright, so here we have one of the 2 new containers that I built for these little guys, into which we're going to release the worms that we hauled out of bin number 1. And these bins were established quite a while ago, a few weeks ago, in anticipation of needing to have a nice cozy home for these worms to be moved into. So this stuff has been priming here for some time, and I've even plopped in some food for them. So when they arrive and they start burrowing down into the bedding, they'll have a nice little snack to feast on. So I've also gone ahead, as I was kind of letting the worms settle down into their material in the old bin, and while I was bringing the new bin out here, I also went back and I fished all the little straggler worms that I could find on those 2 pieces of plastic that had been covering up the horizontal migration feeding zone. So I was just using this piece of cardboard as a place to place them all as I was collecting them. Hopefully they've all managed to slither into a nice dark, damp spot, because I don't see any of them anymore, but they were all over this thing. So either way, all this stuff is going in, this one as well as this one, and man, oh man, is there a lot of material here. I'm glad I left some space in these containers here to plop all this stuff into. I didn't anticipate needing so much space, but I'm glad I didn't, you know, overly pack these bins with bedding material. So I'm trying to think of how to pull this off without making a huge mess. I guess, you know what, let's do a quick inversion of the containers. Oops, there I go, making a mess. So my hope was that I can simply eject the contents without leaving behind any worms. And it seems like we were successful in the round container to make that happen. Let's see how we did in the square container. Here I do see a few worms stuck to the box that we're gonna pull out and rescue. And yeah, we definitely brought over a good bit of material by unloading those horizontal migration feeding zones. So now I'm gonna return to my typical routine here whenever we're launching new bins of attempting to level things off to the point where it gives all the worms that we've brought over into this container pretty much equal access to the material below, so they can all slither out of sight into the darkness of the bedding below. And while that happens, I'm going to ask each of you to kind of think about a number of worms that you think we've launched bin number 1 here with. Don't forget, there'll be more worms added later when we do the next haul out of the old home that they just got removed from, but this is the launch now of bin number 1, and once they're all settled in, we'll move on to unloading the contents of bin number 2. Alright, it does appear to me like most of the worms have made their way down and out of view. There was just this one worm that seemed like it wasn't even budging. And I just hoped that they were still okay, but I see movement now. It seemed like being out in the light they should have been squirming already, but sometimes these worms are just a little bit lethargical, or maybe just not enough of their body was exposed to the lights above to make them react. So I was glad to see that the little guy was okay and just perhaps a little bit slowed down and not moving. So I've got some stuff over here besides just bringing the bubble wrap plastic back on. I've got a feeding zone indicator. Now, when I did put food in here for them, I did sort of spread it out all over the place. So usually my feeding zone indicators are meant to show a specific spot where we last fed. In this case, it's just being thrown in here for future use because there's no one particular spot where the food was placed. And then before we put in the plastic covering over everything, sometimes I also like to include a little piece of paper onto which any moisture that tends to recirculate beneath the plastic surface, you know, a piece of material onto which the moisture can recirculate and drop onto as it condenses. So here's another little wormy. So I think that's it. We will be adding more worms to this system at some point in the near future, but for now, that's bin number 1, and we'll get around to labeling it soon. For now, I think it's time to get this thing out of the way and get to work on the same setup for bins number 2. So now I do put a fair bit of effort into trying to keep things consistent when I've got bins like this that are paired up as bins number 1 and 2 with possibly the same launch date, possibly even a very similar, if not the same, thought to be same exact number of worms occupying them both, meaning that equal amounts of bedding, equal amounts of food, very common handling methods are all followed. Not so much that I'm trying to ensure or increase the likelihood of consistent results, but just to maybe possibly set the stage for that possibly happening. If it happens, then it's great, but if it doesn't, that's fine too. It just seems interesting to manage things very similar to each other so that, if nothing else, you could use any deviations between the two systems as sort of a measure to possibly troubleshoot or debug situations that are going on that you might not like in one or the other bins. So let's see here. I figured perhaps now, before we remove them and get the coverings out of sight, maybe we can once again take a moment or two to try to depopulate as many worms as possible from the top coverings. Well, like I said earlier, the moisture that would otherwise simply evaporate out of the bin, and in this case the moist side of the bin where the feedings had been getting applied, it's kind of nice to have plastic that captures and recirculates that moisture that would otherwise be lost. But this time of year in my region, in the summertime when things are quite humid, the air is not very receptive to drawing moisture into itself, so evaporation is a lot slower when things are as humid as they are right now. But it still happens. It's just a natural thing. Any moisture, any water at least, that's above the freezing point is always going to some degree be evaporating. So that's the reason in certain cases when it seems appropriate I like to use plastic to try to keep the moisture in the bins, especially in the winter when the air in the house is much drier, quite the opposite of what we've got right now with the high degree of moisture in the air. And when I'm running a feeding zone like this, a horizontal migration feeding zone, keeping things really moist is pretty important, because it is the one thing that's going to convince worms that have come over to check things out to remain, because they find that it's comfortable. I don't know. I think there's probably some sort of a silver bullet equation that allows you to control the behavior of the worms, but it feels like I've not yet fully, completely figured that out. So once again here, we're going to do more or less the same thing we did earlier, which is completely remove the contents of what was established as the horizontal migration feeding zone. Here too, it's perhaps a little bit more difficult to see, but there is a piece of cardboard that was placed in here with the intention of keeping the nice finished castings from getting contaminated by the material used to establish the horizontal migration feeding zone. That too will simply come out, and then I'll fashion a fresh one, I believe, when I redo these migration zones. Because here too I simply have to assume that we're going to have very similar results as far as the depopulation of the finished castings. Chances are we're going to have a whole lot of straggler worms remaining in the material that still need extra time to be hauled out. And I guess it will be interesting to see, because you never know. Perhaps we'll find a whole lot more worms in the horizontal migration feeding zone of this system, and far fewer worms in the finished castings. And for whatever reason, even though I might have put every effort into trying to maintain consistency between the systems, maybe perhaps the material in this one has managed to dry out a little bit more to the point where we were able to more effectively motivate our worms to exit the material and seek out something more comfortable. And in this case, the more comfortable thing is the horizontal migration feeding zone. Okay, I believe we've kind of reached the capacity of the first container here. I believe we can simply bring over these remnants of the partition, try to also take this little bit of debris that fell out instead of letting it get tangled in with the finished castings. I like the finished castings to be pretty debris free if possible, you know. So why not? If it's possible to exert a little bit of extra effort and come up with uncontaminated, fairly clean worm castings, I feel better about using this stuff out in the garden and not feeling like I'm going to be bringing a bunch of litter out there. Not that little scraps of paper or cardboard out in the garden would be litter per se. It would eventually break down out there as well, but perhaps not as quickly as in a worm bin. So, looks like we're probably going to, once again, come pretty close to hitting the capacity of these 2 plastic containers we're using to do the haul out and movement of the worms from their old home into their new home. I hope we've got enough space here. Once again, I'm starting to get the sense that we've probably collected a fairly equivalent number of worms in both systems on this initial haul out, kind of making me sense that it seems pretty likely that we're going to find a whole bunch of stragglers remaining in the finished castings end of the bin, requiring some additional time to make their way out as well. So it's at this time I'm usually trying to formulate in my mind a little bit of a estimate of how many worms I believe I've managed to haul out, and then there's also obviously the observation of how many worms I'm seeing when they're released into their new home. So during those 2 opportunities to see the worms, I'm doing my best to establish some sort of a guesstimate as far as how many worms I believe have been used to launch off my new worm bin. So here on this cardboard piece, there's a good number of worms, probably right in between the layers of the cardboard too and stuff. So yeah, things look pretty nice in here. I think like we did before, we're going to do a quick tilling up of the finished material to see how things look and to gauge how many worms were left behind in this haul out. But if you have, you know, if I had to guess, I would have to assume that we've got quite a few, just like we saw in the other system. So let's do a quick examination of the material. See how many worms were left behind. Over here on the very far end, where it's been left to dry and where it was the most distant from the feeding zones, it does seem like the depopulation of the material has been quite successful. And all this nice material on the surface that has had a chance to dry is now getting blended in with this more damp stuff that's down lower. And hopefully as a result of that, it'll send this stuff as a whole into a somewhat drier state. Let's see how things on this edge look. The edge closest to where the feeding zone was is where you're most likely to find a good number of worms still hanging out, still needing to be convinced that there's probably a better place to go and hang out. It's just the material on the very bottom is where you're most likely to observe the most number of worms, especially when they start sensing the dryness encroaching from the top surface. They just do what they always do, especially like what they do out in nature, is they just dive down and seek more damp and comfortable accommodations. So I still like to use this as an opportunity to take the more dry stuff, blend it with the more damp stuff, and I'll probably do a little bit more of that too later, prior to reestablishing the migration feeding zones, in order to get these migrations to resume and continue. But I think we're going to give these little guys a moment to just dive down. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and fetch the new home for the holes that the new home the new home for the worms that we did haul out, so we can release them and be done with today's video. right, and here we have the new home for the worms that we just hauled out of bin number 2. And this will have a similar name. This will be bin number 2 as well. I guess the main difference is just going to be the launch dates. And like I said, both of these bins were fed. So if you dig down, you'll see purple cabbage, you'll see some grit down there. So these are pre-fed systems. So we won't have to check in on these guys right away. They'll be okay for a little while. But let's not dawdle. Let's get these little guys released into their new home. Once again, we're going to try to gracefully unload these transport containers without making a huge mess. And maybe I just jinxed myself by, vocalizing my intent here. But once again, I'm going to do a quick inversion of the material, or at least the containers, and the material inside, in the hopes that we manage to eject all the contents, primarily the worms. The lingering castings that are still stuck to the container can get shaken out later, but I wouldn't want a little stranded worm to remain in the transport container and then possibly stay there and dry out. So here I want to be pretty thorough, same as I was with the top covering plastics, to make sure it's been cleared of any lingering stragglers. But luckily when you do this, you eject the material, the worms do tend to stay in the nice moist castings as opposed to adhering to the plastic container. So once again, as much as I would like to think that it would be nice to have an equal number of worms getting released into each of these new systems, most often my viewers tend to come up with fairly specific estimates. When they think a bin has more worms in it than another, they'll certainly be vocal about it. So once again, please provide me with your estimates. How many worms do you think we just released into bin number 2? And don't forget, I also want to hear what you think in terms of how many worms were released into bin number 1. And then we'll be done. Alright, so like we did before, we're going to be commissioning a new feeding zone indicator, and as I showed you a moment ago, the food in this system is pretty much spread out everywhere, so it's certainly not focused down the middle like we usually do when we're feeding my systems. But when we feed next time, we'll probably just dig open a trench and place their feeding into a somewhat focused area, and then this will become our little indicator to show us where we last fed. It's not that much of a mystery. I usually just feed down the middle. And then, like we did in bin number 1, same thing. We're going to be bringing in this somewhat soiled piece of paper to serve as sort of a top covering, a landing pad, if you will, for the recirculating moisture within the bin. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what people think in terms of their estimates for how many worms live in these systems. But before we finish the video, there is one final order of business, and I think a lot of you know exactly what that is. So why don't we get to it? Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in christening the 2 newest systems in my wormery. ENC bin number 1 and ENC bin number 2. So we've still got a little bit of work to do, work that I'll do off camera. Resetting the feeding zones. We'll be having to revisit these systems at some point in the near future to give them their first feeding, and it's quite possible that the next introduction of more worms to these after the final haul out of their old home can be done will come weeks from now. It's hard to say when that might play out, so whatever, I'm not holding my breath. It'll get done when it gets done. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.